Hello my dear viewers, I would like to thank you for watching the video and I wanted to say subscribe to my YouTube channel. I will be very grateful and you will not miss new videos. Enjoy the video. My name is Darren Hart and I've been a private investigator for 8 years. Over the years, I've dealt with everything from missing pets to cheating spouses, but nothing prepared me for the case I took last October. It all started when I got a call from Mrs. Louise Harper, the manager of a rundown apartment complex on the edge of downtown Chicago. Her voice trembled as she spoke, and I could tell right away she wasn't used to asking for help. "Mr. Hart," she said, "one of my tenants has gone missing. His name is Vincent Monroe, and I'm worried something's happened to him." Missing persons weren't my usual line of work, but I was between cases, and something about the way she sounded piqued my interest. I agreed to meet her the next morning. The apartment complex was worse than I expected: peeling paint, flickering hallway lights, and a smell like damp carpet. Mrs. Harper was waiting for me in the lobby, clutching a folder of papers to her chest like a shield. "Vincent's been living here for 2 years," she explained as we rode the creaky elevator up to the 7th floor. "Always paid his rent on time, kept to himself. But no one's seen him in almost a week, and his rent's overdue. That's not like him." "Have you contacted the police?" I asked. She shook her head quickly. "I don't want trouble for the building. We've had incidents here before." That last part caught my attention. I made a mental note to ask her about it later. When we reached Vincent's apartment, Mrs. Harper handed me the key with a nervous glance. "I already tried knocking," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I opened the door and stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with the smell of dust and something faintly metallic. The apartment was neat, almost unnervingly so: no dishes in the sink, no clutter on the counters. But it didn't feel right. I found my first clue in the living room. A coffee table had been pushed to one side, and the rug underneath it was bunched up, as if someone had been in a hurry. A single shoe lay discarded near the couch, its laces undone. "Vincent," I called, even though I knew no one would answer. Then I noticed something strange. The walls, they were bare, except for one. A large mirror hung directly across from the couch. It was the only decoration in the entire apartment, and something about it made my skin crawl. When I looked closer, I saw fingerprints smudged across the glass. And in the middle of the mirror, etched faintly into the surface, were 4 words: "Do not look back." I stood frozen in front of the mirror, staring at the faint words, "Do not look back." The way the letters were etched, like they'd been scratched into the glass with something sharp, sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just the message, it was the fingerprints all around it, smeared and chaotic, as if someone had been clawing at the mirror. I reached out, running my fingers over the surface. The scratches felt fresh, the edges rough against my skin. "Is something wrong?" Mrs. Harper's voice startled me, and I turned quickly. "Have you been in here since he disappeared?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. She shook her head, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her cardigan. "No, I told you this is the first time I've been inside. I didn't want to intrude." I glanced around the room again, noticing little details I hadn't before. A half-empty glass of water on the kitchen counter, a jacket draped neatly over a chair, a stack of unopened mail by the door. It was as if Vincent had just stepped out for a moment and never come back. But the message in the mirror suggested something darker. "Did Vincent ever mention anything unusual?" I asked. "Strange visitors, odd behavior, Anything like that? Mrs. Harper hesitated, her eyes darting toward the mirror before quickly looking away. He kept to himself, she said carefully, but there was one thing. I waited, sensing she wasn't telling me everything. About a month ago, he came down to the lobby, looking pale as a ghost, she said finally. He asked if there had been any reports of noises. She nodded. He said he kept hearing someone whispering his name at night. But when he'd get up to check, no one was there. My stomach tightened, and you didn't think to follow up on that. She bristled. I'm not a detective, Mr. Hart. He said it was probably just the wind or the pipes. I glanced back at the mirror, unease growing in my chest. Did he ever say where he heard the whispers coming from? The hallway, she said quietly, right outside his door. Before I could respond, a faint creak echoed from behind me. I spun around, my pulse quickening. The apartment was empty. Did you hear that? I whispered. Mrs. Harper nodded, her face pale. It came from the hallway. I stepped out of the apartment, peering into the dimly lit corridor. The air felt colder out here, heavier. As I moved further down the hall, something caught my eye, a faint smear of red on the wall, just a few feet from Vincent's door. I crouched to get a better look. It was dried blood, streaked in a straight line as if someone had dragged their hand along the wall. The trail led to the end of the hallway, stopping abruptly in front of an old wooden door. That's the maintenance closet, Mrs. Harper whispered, clutching her sweater tightly. But no one's used it in years. My hand moved to the doorknob. It was ice cold, and the second I touched it, I felt a prickling sensation crawl up my arm. Wait, Mrs. Harper said, her voice trembling. Maybe we should call the police. I turned to her, but before I could answer, a loud thud came from behind the door. The loud thud echoed through the hallway, sending a jolt of adrenaline through me. I hesitated, my hand still on the doorknob of the maintenance closet. Behind me, Mrs. Harper took a step back, her face as pale as the flickering fluorescent lights above us. Don't open it, she whispered, her voice trembling. But I wasn't about to leave without knowing what was inside. If Vincent was in there, or if there was any clue about what happened to him, I had to find out. I twisted the knob and pushed the door open. The hinges creaked loudly, revealing a small, cramped room filled with dusty shelves, old tools, and cleaning supplies. The air inside was stale, carrying the scent of mildew and rust. At first glance, there was nothing unusual, but then I saw the floor. A large, dark stain spread across the cracked linoleum, and even in the dim light, I could tell what it was: blood. Jesus, I muttered, crouching down to get a closer look. The blood had dried, but it wasn't ancient. Maybe a few days old, at most. Mrs. Harper stood frozen in the doorway, her hand covering her mouth. This can't be real. I've never seen anything like this before. I pulled out my phone, using the flashlight to scan the room. That's when I noticed something else, a faint scuff mark on the floor, leading to the far corner where an old shelving unit leaned against the wall. The scuff mark looked like it had been made recently, as if something heavy had been dragged. Help me move this, I said, motioning to the shelf. Mrs. Harper hesitated, but the look in my eyes must have convinced her. Together we pushed the shelf aside, the sound of metal scraping against the floor echoing through the tiny room. Behind it was a small, square opening in the wall, a crawl space. The opening was barely big enough for a person to fit through, but the edges were smeared with more blood. My stomach churned as I realized this wasn't just a random hiding spot. Someone had been dragged through here. What? What is that, Mrs. Harper stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. Instead, I crouched down, shining my flashlight into the crawl space. It was dark and narrow, the walls lined with cobwebs and grime. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, disappearing into shadows. Then, just as I was about to look away, I saw it. A single, muddy handprint on the inside wall of the crawl space. The handprint was fresh. Vincent, I called, my voice echoing faintly. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, from deep within the crawl space, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a whisper, faint, raspy, and impossible to make out. But I recognized one thing. It was saying my name. The whispering sound sent a shiver down my spine. Darren. It was faint but unmistakable, echoing from deep within the crawl space. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I stared into the dark tunnel. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Mrs. Harper shook her head furiously, her back pressed against the wall as if she was trying to get as far away as possible. "No, and I don't want to. Whatever this is, it's not right." She was right about one thing: this wasn't right, but I couldn't walk away now. "I have to check it out," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're out of your mind," Mrs. Harper hissed. What if it's him?" I didn't answer. Instead, I knelt down and crawled into the narrow opening, the cold, damp air wrapping around me like a shroud. My flashlight illuminated the space ahead, but the shadows seemed to press in closer with every inch I moved forward. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just my name anymore. It was fragments of sentences, disjointed and eerie. "Help me, please. It's coming." I stopped crawling, my heart hammering in my chest. "Vincent, is that you?" The whisper stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. And then, somewhere ahead of me, something moved. It was subtle, just the faintest shuffling sound, like fabric brushing against the walls. My flashlight beam darted around, but all I could see were cobwebs and dirt. "Darren, come back." Mrs. Harper's voice called from behind me, but it sounded so far away now. I forced myself to keep going, the whispers echoing in my ears as I crawled deeper into the tunnel. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in around me. After what felt like an eternity, I saw something ahead. The tunnel opened up into a small chamber. My flashlight revealed a tangle of old wires and broken pipes hanging from the ceiling, but that wasn't what caught my attention. In the center of the chamber was a figure, hunched and unmoving. "Vincent," I whispered, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. It looked human, at least I thought it did. But as I stepped closer, the flashlight beam revealed something that made my stomach turn. The figure's skin was pale and stretched taut, its face frozen in a grotesque expression of terror. Its hands were clawed, with dried blood caked under the nails. And its eyes were wide open, staring directly at me. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering as the whispers suddenly returned, louder and more urgent. "Don't look back. Don't look back." The figure's mouth moved, its jaw creaking open unnaturally wide, and a guttural, inhuman voice spilled out, "You shouldn't have come." The figure's voice echoed through the chamber, low and guttural, vibrating in my chest. "You shouldn't have come." I stumbled backward, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. "Vincent," I whispered again, though deep down I knew the thing in front of me wasn't him. The figure didn't move. Its unblinking eyes were locked on mine, but something about the way it sat there, hunched and frozen, made it seem wrong, like it was waiting for something. Behind me, the whispering grew louder. It wasn't coming from the figure, it was coming from the tunnel I had just crawled through. "Darren, don't look back." The voice was raspy and faint, but now it was joined by others, overlapping and chaotic. "Get out? It's coming. Don't turn around." I felt cold air brush the back of my neck, and my stomach churned. I didn't want to turn around, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I twisted my head to look over my shoulder. The flashlight beam flickered as it swept over the tunnel behind me. At first, I saw nothing but darkness, but then, just at the edge of the light, something moved. It was a shadow, tall and unnaturally thin, slithering across the walls and ceiling. It moved like smoke, twisting and curling as it came closer. My chest tightened, and I forced myself to look back at the figure in the chamber. It was gone. The spot where it had been sitting was empty, but I hadn't heard it move. Panic set in. I scrambled to crawl back through the tunnel, my hands and knees scraping against the rough walls. The whispers followed me, louder and more frantic, urging me to move faster. "Don't let it touch you. Don't let it touch you." The cold air behind me grew stronger, and I could feel the presence of the shadow creeping closer. It wasn't just in the tunnel, it was in the walls, the floor, the very air around me. By the time I reached the opening, I was gasping for breath. I pulled myself out of the crawl space and slammed my back against the wall, clutching my flashlight like a weapon. Mrs. Harper was standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. "What's wrong? What happened? Get out of here," I panted, struggling to catch my breath. "We need to leave now." She hesitated, glancing at the crawl space behind me. "Did you find him? Did you find Vincent?" "No," I said, shaking my head. "But something's down there, and it's not human." Before she could respond, a loud, bone-chilling scream erupted from the crawl space. It was inhuman, guttural, and filled with rage. Mrs. Harper screamed, backing away from the door. "What is that?" I grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the hallway. "We're not staying to find out," but as we ran, the lights in the hallway flickered violently. Shadows stretched and twisted along the walls, moving faster than they should. And then, just as we reached the elevator, the doors slammed shut on their own. The shadow was here. The elevator doors shut with a deafening clang, plunging the hallway into silence. Mrs. Harper clung to my arm, her face pale and streaked with sweat. "It's here," she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't need her to tell me. The air had turned icy, and the shadows along the walls were alive, twisting and curling like they had a mind of their own. "We have to get to the stairs," I said, keeping my voice low. Mrs. Harper nodded, but her steps were unsteady as we moved toward the stairwell at the end of the hall. Each step felt like it took an eternity, and the flickering lights made it hard to tell where the shadows ended and the darkness began. Halfway there, a sound stopped us in our tracks, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I shone my flashlight down the hall, and that's when I saw it, the shadow. It was no longer slithering along the walls, it had taken form, standing at the far end of the hallway. It was tall and thin, with impossibly long limbs and a face that seemed to shift and blur, like smoke caught in the wind. Its eyes, or what I thought were its eyes, glowed faintly to pinpoints of pale light that pierced through the darkness, and it was moving toward us. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Mrs. Harper's arm and pulling her with me. We bolted down the hall, the sound of our footsteps echoing against the walls. The growl grew louder, turning into a roar that vibrated in my chest. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel the shadow closing in, its cold presence crawling up my spine. When we reached the stairwell door, I yanked it open and shoved Mrs. Harper inside. She stumbled onto the landing, and I followed, slamming the door shut behind us. For a moment there was silence. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. Mrs. Harper was crouched on the floor, shaking. "Did we lose it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. My hand was still on the door, and I could feel the cold seeping through the metal, like the shadow was just on the other side. Then the lights in the stairwell flickered. "No," I whispered. "It's not gone." A low growl echoed from below, and I realized with horror that the shadow wasn't just behind the door, it was in the stairwell too. "We have to keep moving," I said, pulling Mrs. Harper to her feet. We started down the stairs, moving as quickly as we could. The growl followed us, growing louder with each step. By the time we reached the second floor, the lights went out completely. "Darren!" Mrs. Harper cried, her voice filled with panic. "I'm here," I said, grabbing her hand. My flashlight was the only source of light now, its beam cutting through the suffocating darkness. But the shadows were everywhere, creeping up the walls and swirling around us. They were alive, reaching out with claw-like tendrils that seemed to dissolve into smoke the moment they touched the light. Then, ahead of us, I saw it, the door to the lobby. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of pale light spilling through. "There!" I shouted, pulling Mrs. Harper toward it. We ran, the shadows closing in around us. The growl turned into a deafening roar, and I felt something cold brush against my arm, like icy fingers clawing at me. We burst through the door and into the lobby, the sudden brightness blinding us. I turned and slammed the door shut, pressing my weight against it as if that could keep the shadow out. For a moment, everything was still. Then, from behind the door, I heard the whispers again. "Don't look back. Don't look back." I stood against the stairwell door, my chest heaving, the whispers echoing in my ears. "Don't look back. Don't look back." Mrs. Harper collapsed onto a nearby chair, trembling and clutching her sweater like it was the only thing holding her together. What was that thing?" she stammered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I admitted, my own voice shaky. "But it's not over." The whispers grew fainter, fading into the silence. Slowly, I stepped away from the door, half expecting it to burst open, but it didn't. The lobby was still, the faint hum of the flickering fluorescent lights the only sound. I turned to Mrs. Harper. "We need to call the police. Whatever this is, it's beyond us." She nodded weakly, and I pulled out my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed. But before I could press call, something caught my eye. The large mirror on the lobby wall. At first glance, it looked normal. But as I stepped closer, I saw them fingerprints smeared across the glass, just like the mirror in Vincent's apartment. And in the center of the mirror, etched faintly into the surface, were the same four words, "Do not look back." My blood turned to ice, the door behind me creaked, and a cold draft swept through the lobby. Mrs. Harper screamed. I spun around, my flashlight snapping to the stairwell door, which had inched open just enough to reveal the darkness beyond. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent now, overlapping in a chaotic chorus. Don't look. It's watching. Don't let it see you. And then I heard it, the low, guttural growl that I would never forget. I grabbed Mrs. Harper's arm and pulled her toward the exit. We're leaving now. The front doors of the building were just a few steps away, but every step felt like a mile. The growl grew louder, and the air around us grew colder with every passing second. We reached the doors, and I threw them open, dragging Mrs. Harper outside. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop until we were in the middle of the parking lot, far away from the building. Hello my dear viewers, I would like to thank you for watching the video, and I wanted to say subscribe to my YouTube channel. I will be very grateful and you will not miss new videos. Enjoy the video. My name is Josh Miller and I've always thought of myself as a regular guy. I live in Chicago, I work in IT, and my life is about as exciting as a tax seminar. Or at least it was until the day I found that apartment. It started on a Thursday. I just moved into a new place, a decent little studio on the edge of downtown. Nothing fancy, but it had a good view of the city, and for someone like me, that was enough. I was unpacking when I noticed something strange. The floor plan didn't match. Let me explain. When I first toured the place, the agent gave me a blueprint of the apartment. It was supposed to be straightforward, a single open room with a kitchenette and a tiny bathroom off to the side. But when I stood in the living room, something felt wrong. The wall across from me seemed closer than it should have been, like there was something behind it. I pulled out the blueprint and double-checked. Sure enough, there was supposed to be an extra 3 feet of space behind that wall. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe it was just poor construction, but curiosity got the better of me, and I started knocking on the wall, looking for anything unusual. That's when I heard a hollow sound. I froze, my hand still pressed against the drywall. Hollow walls meant space, right? But there wasn't supposed to be anything back there. Grabbing a flashlight from one of the moving boxes, I crouched down and inspected the baseboard. That's when I noticed something odd. There was a tiny seam in the wall, barely visible unless you were looking for it. I pressed my fingers against it, and to my surprise, the panel popped open. Behind it was a narrow passage. It wasn't much, just a dark, cramped corridor that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The air smelled stale, like dust and mildew. I should have closed the panel and gone back to unpacking. But something about the passage called to me, like it was daring me to explore. I stepped inside, flashlight in hand, and started walking. The corridor was tight, the walls pressing in on either side. After a few feet, it opened into a small, windowless room. The first thing I noticed was the furniture. It was old, really old. A battered armchair sat in one corner, its fabric torn and stained. There was a wooden table with deep scratches across the surface and a rusted lamp that didn't look like it had worked in years. But what really caught my attention was the wall. It was covered in photographs, dozens of them, pinned up haphazardly. Some were black and white, others faded with age. They all showed the same thing: people. Random people walking through the city, sitting in cafes, standing at bus stops. And in every photo, their faces were crossed out with thick, red ink. My stomach churned as I scanned the wall, my flashlight trembling. These weren't just snapshots, they felt deliberate, like someone had been watching these people. In the center of the wall was a larger photo, framed and hung like a centerpiece. It was of a man, mid-30s, clean-shaven, wearing a suit and tie. His face wasn't crossed out like the others, but there was something unsettling about the way he looked at the camera, like he knew whoever was taking the picture. Beneath the frame was a single word scrawled in red ink, WHY. That was enough for me. I turned and bolted back through the passage, slamming the panel shut behind me. My heart was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just walked into something I wasn't supposed to see. But as I stood there, trying to calm down, I heard it. A soft creak. It came from inside the passage. Someone or something was moving in there. I froze, my ear pressed against the wall, straining to hear. The creaking sound wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, slow, measured, like someone taking careful steps. I wanted to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the building was old, the pipes shifting, or the walls settling. But deep down, I knew better. Someone or something was in that passage. I grabbed my phone and called the landlord. It went straight to voicemail. Figures. "Hi, this is Josh Miller in 3C, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I think there's something weird going on with the apartment. Can you call me back when you get this?" I hung up and stood there for a moment, debating what to do. I didn't hear the creaking anymore, but that didn't mean whoever or whatever it was had left. The rest of the night was a blur. I stayed in the living room, pacing back and forth, staring at the spot where the panel was hidden. I didn't sleep. I didn't even try. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was time to leave. Whatever this was, I didn't want any part of it. I started packing my things when my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. You shouldn't have opened it. I stared at the screen, my stomach churning. How did they have my number? My hand shook as I typed back, "Who is this?" No response. Instead, I heard a knock at the door. I approached cautiously, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. But when I peeked through the peephole, I saw a man standing in the hallway. He was wearing a suit and tie, his face clean-shaven, his posture rigid. It was the man from the photograph. My breath caught in my throat. He didn't move, didn't knock again. He just stood there, staring straight ahead like he knew I was watching. I stepped back, my heart pounding. This wasn't possible. The photograph looked like it was decades old. How could he be standing here now? The knocking came again, louder this time. I backed away, clutching my phone, debating whether to call the police. But before I could dial, the knocking stopped. When I looked through the peephole again, he was gone. That evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The air in the apartment felt heavier, like the walls were closing in. I kept hearing faint sounds, creaks, whispers, the occasional soft thud, but every time I checked, there was nothing there. Then I heard the panel. It was a soft click, like someone opening it. My blood ran cold as I grabbed my flashlight and crept toward the wall. I pressed my ear against it, listening. Nothing. Slowly, I pushed the panel open, shining the flashlight inside. The passage was empty, just as dark and narrow as before. But when I stepped inside, I noticed something new. Another photograph. It was pinned to the far wall where the furniture and other photos had been. This one was of me, taken from the passage. I was sitting on my couch, staring at the wall. The time stamp in the corner was from last night. Pinned beneath the photo was a note, "You're next." I don't think I've ever been as terrified as I was in that moment. Seeing myself in the photograph, proof that someone had been in my apartment watching me, made my stomach churn. I stumbled out of the passage, slamming the panel shut behind me. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the flashlight. I grabbed my phone and called 911. The operator's voice was calm, almost detached. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone in my apartment, I stammered. They've been inside. They've been watching me. Are they in the apartment now? I hesitated, glancing toward the panel. I don't know. The operator asked for my address and told me to stay on the line, but I couldn't. I hung up and grabbed my keys, ready to leave. But when I opened the door to the hallway, I froze. The man in the suit was standing there again. His expression was blank, almost bored, but his eyes locked onto mine as soon as the door opened. "You can't leave," he said. His voice was calm, matter-of-fact, like he was stating the weather. I didn't respond. I just slammed the door and locked it, my heart racing. I grabbed my backpack and stuffed it with whatever I could find: wallet, phone, charger, a bottle of water. I didn't care about anything else. All I knew was that I had to get out of there. I ran to the window, my mind racing. I was on the 3rd floor, but maybe I could climb down somehow. Before I could decide, I heard it again, the creaking. This time, it wasn't coming from the panel. It was coming from inside the apartment. I turned slowly, my flashlight scanning the room. The shadows seemed deeper, darker, like they were alive. "Josh," a voice whispered. I whipped around, the beam of light catching the edge of the couch. No one was there. "Josh," the voice said again, closer this time. It wasn't the man in the suit. It was me. The voice was mine, but it was distorted, wrong, like hearing a recording played underwater. I backed toward the door, my breath coming in short gasps. The panel on the wall creaked open, and for a split second I saw something move inside. A shadow, tall and angular, just before the panel slammed shut again. I yanked the door open and ran. The hallway was empty. I bolted for the stairs, taking them two at a time. My only thought was to get as far away from that apartment as possible. When I reached the lobby, I saw the police officers talking to the landlord. Relief flooded through me as I rushed toward them. "You have to help me," I said, my voice shaking. "Someone's in my apartment. They've been following me." The landlord frowned. "Josh, what are you talking about?" I opened my mouth to respond, but one of the officers cut me off. "What apartment are you in?" 3C, I said. The landlord's frown deepened. 3C. "That's been empty for years." I froze. "What?" "No, I just moved in a week ago." The landlord shook his head. "That apartment's been boarded up since the fire. No one's lived there since." His words cut off as the officers exchanged a look. "What fire?" I demanded. The landlord hesitated. "It happened 5 years ago. Some guy lived there, kept to himself, didn't talk to anyone. One day, there was smoke pouring out of the place. By the time the fire department got in, he was gone. Just disappeared." "What was his name?" I asked, my stomach twisting. The landlord hesitated again, then finally said, "Frank. Something. Frank Miller." My blood ran cold. Miller. That was my last name. My knees went weak. Miller. My last name? Was it a coincidence? It had to be, right? "No," I said, shaking my head. That's not possible. I moved in last week. I've been staying there and packing, sleeping, everything. The landlord's expression darkened. Josh, you've got the wrong apartment. 3C is sealed. It's been vacant since the fire. One of the officers stepped forward. Sir, we'll go upstairs and take a look. Why don't you wait here? No, I said quickly. I'm coming with you. You need to see it for yourself. We climbed the stairs together, my heart pounding louder with every step. When we reached the third floor, I froze. The door to 3C was different. It wasn't the plain brown door I'd left behind. It was charred, blackened by fire, with a faint smell of smoke still clinging to it. Yellow caution tape crisscrossed the frame, brittle and faded. This can't be right, I whispered. The officer nearest to me pulled out a flashlight and shone it at the door. Sir, no one's been in here for years. It's condemned. I didn't believe him. I shoved past them, pushing the door open. It creaked loudly, the hinges stiff with rust. The air inside was thick and heavy, carrying the acrid smell of soot and decay. The apartment was nothing like I remembered. The walls were scorched, the furniture reduced to ash and twisted metal. The window I'd tried to climb out of was shattered, the glass still littering the floor. This isn't real, I muttered, stepping inside. This isn't my apartment, but it was. In the corner, half buried in debris, was the panel I'd found. It was partially open, just as I'd left it. The officer followed my gaze, frowning. What's that? I didn't answer. I walked to the panel and pushed it open. The passage was still there, just as dark and narrow as before. I told you, I said, my voice trembling, there's something in here. The officer hesitated, then motioned for his partner to follow. Stay behind us. We stepped into the passage, the beam of their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The walls felt closer than I remembered, the air colder. When we reached the end, the small room was just as I'd left it. The scratched table, the old chair, the photographs on the wall, everything was there. Except for one thing, the man in the suit was sitting in the chair. His face was shadowed, but I recognized him instantly. My breath caught in my throat as the officers froze, their flashlights fixed on him. Sir, you need to stand up, one of them said, his voice steady but tense. The man didn't move. Sir, I'm giving you one last chance, the officer warned. Still nothing. The second officer moved closer, reaching out to grab the man's shoulder. The moment he touched him, the lights went out. The darkness was absolute, swallowing everything. I couldn't see, couldn't hear anything except my own breathing, and then the voice came again. You shouldn't have come back, Josh. It was him, the man in the suit, but it was also me. The sound of footsteps echoed around the room, circling me closer and closer. My chest tightened as panic took over. Who are you? I shouted into the void. His voice came from behind me, cold and steady. I'm what you left behind. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on. The room was empty. The officers were gone. And the photographs on the wall, they were different. They all showed me. Dozens of pictures, taken at different points in my life, playing as a kid, sitting in class, walking to work. In the center was the same photograph I'd seen before, the man in the suit. Only now, his face wasn't blank, it was mine. Beneath it, written in red ink, was a single word, welcome. The screen fades to black as Josh's voice delivers the final line. Josh voiceover, some places don't just remember you. They hold on to you forever. Text appears on screen. The end. Hello my dear viewers, I would like to thank you for watching the video and I wanted to say subscribe to my YouTube channel. I will be very grateful and you will not miss new videos. Enjoy the video. My name's Laura Kemp and I work as a crime scene investigator in New York. I've seen it all: horrific murders, botched robberies, and more than a few cases that kept me awake at night. But nothing prepared me for what I found in room 309 of the Grand Line Hotel. It was supposed to be a quiet evening. I was just wrapping up paperwork when I got the call. A suspicious death. The voice on the other end of the line was Detective Marcus Hale, my longtime partner in these cases. "You'll want to see this one," he said, his tone grim. When I arrived at the scene, the Grand Line was crawling with officers and curious onlookers. The hotel manager, a frazzled man in a wrinkled suit, was pacing in the lobby, wringing his hands. "Third floor," Marcus said, greeting me near the elevator. "You're not gonna believe this. Room 309 was a mid-range suite, nothing fancy, just a single queen bed, a desk, and a small sitting area. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt the weight of something wrong. The victim was a man in his 40s, well-dressed in a navy suit. He was sitting in the chair by the window, his body slumped forward, hands resting limply on his knees. The strangest part, there wasn't a single mark on him. No blood, no sign of a struggle. The room itself was eerily pristine. The bed was made, the carpet was clean, and nothing appeared out of place. Except for one thing, the door. It had been locked from the inside. Not just the regular lock, both the deadbolt and the chain were engaged. It took hotel staff nearly 20 minutes to break in, and when they did, they found the victim exactly as I was seeing him now, lifeless with no clear cause of death. I crouched next to the body, careful not to touch anything. "What do we know about him?" I asked Marcus. "Name's Richard Mayfield," he said, flipping through his notepad. "Business executive from Boston. Checked in 3 nights ago. No visitors, no signs of forced entry, and according to the front desk, no one came or went from this room all day." I frowned, scanning the scene. "Windows locked from the inside," Marcus said. "And we're 3 floors up. No fire escape, no balconies. It didn't make sense. A locked room, no visible injuries, no signs of foul play. But my gut told me there was more to this than met the eye. Then something caught my attention, a faint indentation on the carpet near the desk. I moved closer, squinting in the dim light. It was circular, about the size of a coffee mug, but it didn't match anything in the room. "Marcus," I said, pointing to the spot, "what do you make of this?" He knelt beside me, his brow furrowing. "Could be nothing. Or it could be the clue that breaks this wide open." Before we could investigate further, a uniformed officer poked his head into the room. "Detectives, you'll want to see this," he said, his voice tense. "It's from the security footage." We followed him to the hotel's back office, where a grainy black and white video was paused on the screen. The timestamp showed it was from the hallway outside room 309, taken less than an hour before the body was discovered. Marcus nodded at the officer to play it. The footage showed the empty hallway, nothing unusual. But then, at exactly 6:14 p.m., the door to room 309 opened slightly. No one stepped out, no one went in. The door closed again. And then, nothing. I leaned closer to the monitor, my heart racing. "You're telling me no one entered or left the room after this?" I asked, pointing at the screen. The officer shook his head. We've reviewed all the footage from today. The only person who entered the room was Mr. Mayfield, and that was hours before he was found. Marcus crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. So, what are we saying here? The door opened on its own, and then the guy just died. Something's missing, I said, my mind spinning. Can you rewind a few minutes before that timestamp? The officer obliged, scrubbing back through the footage. At first, it was the same uneventful hallway. Then, at 6:10 p.m., something strange happened. The light above room 309 flickered. Not a quick blink, but a slow, rhythmic dimming, like the bulb was pulsing. It lasted about 30 seconds before stabilizing. "What the hell was that?" Marcus muttered. "Electrical issue," I offered, though I didn't believe it myself. The footage continued to play, and when the clock hit 6:14, the door to room 309 creaked open again. This time, I noticed something chilling, a shadow. It was faint, barely visible, but it moved across the floor just inside the doorway. The shadow wasn't shaped like a person. It was warped, jagged, almost insect-like, and then the door shut. "Pause it," I said sharply. The screen froze, the faint shadow still visible. My skin prickled as I stared at it. Marcus glanced at me. "What are you thinking?" "I don't know," I admitted, but whatever that is, it wasn't Richard Mayfield. Back in the room, I couldn't shake the image of the shadow from my mind. The indentation on the carpet, the flickering light, the locked door, it all felt connected, but I couldn't figure out how. I examined the desk, searching for anything that might explain the strange mark. That's when I saw it, a USB drive. It was tucked under the edge of the desk, barely visible unless you were looking for it. I grabbed a pair of gloves and carefully pulled it out, holding it up to the light. "What do you think's on it?" Marcus asked. "There's only one way to find out," I said, slipping it into a bag for evidence. But as I stood up, something else caught my attention, a faint buzzing sound. "Do you hear that?" I asked. Marcus tilted his head, listening. "Yeah, sounds like humming." The sound grew louder, coming from the corner of the room. I turned, shining my flashlight toward the noise, the mirror. It was vibrating slightly, as if something was pressing against the other side. The buzzing grew more intense, filling the room with an almost electric hum. "Laura, step back," Marcus warned, pulling his sidearm. But before either of us could move, the mirror shattered. Glass exploded outward, shards raining across the room. I shielded my face, but I caught a glimpse of something, a dark, twisting shape disappearing into the shadows. And then, just as quickly as it started, the room went silent. "What the hell was that?" Marcus shouted, his voice echoing in the stillness. I didn't answer. My eyes were fixed on the fragments of glass scattered across the floor, because etched into one of the larger pieces were 3 words, "They are here." The room was eerily quiet after the mirror shattered. The buzzing was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on my chest. Marcus stepped closer to me, his gun still drawn, his face pale. "What just happened?" he asked, his voice low. I knelt down, examining the shards of glass on the floor. The words etched into the largest piece, "They are here," were unmistakable, like they'd been scratched in with something sharp. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think this goes deeper than Richard Mayfield." We bagged the glass for evidence and left the room, both of us on edge. Back at the station, I plugged the USB drive into a secure computer, my hands trembling slightly. Marcus stood behind me, his arms crossed, his expression grim. The drive contained a single file, a video. "Play it," Marcus said, leaning over my shoulder. I clicked it, and the screen filled with grainy footage. It was a recording of room 309, but from an angle that suggested it had been taken from a hidden camera. The video began with Richard Mayfield sitting at the desk, typing on his laptop. He looked normal, calm, focused, but as the minutes passed, his demeanor changed. He glanced over his shoulder, his movements sharp and paranoid. Then he got up and walked to the door, peering through the peephole before locking the deadbolt and the chain. When he returned to the desk, the light above him began to flicker. "Here we go," Marcus muttered. Mayfield froze, staring up at the light. Then he turned toward the mirror. At first, he just stared at it, his expression blank. But then his face twisted in terror. On the screen, Mayfield stumbled back, clutching his chest as he collapsed into the chair by the window. The light above him flickered one last time and then went out completely. The video ended. "That's it?" Marcus asked, his frustration evident. What the hell was he looking at? I rewound the footage, pausing on the moment Mayfield stared at the mirror. Squinting, I noticed something I hadn't before, a faint distortion in the glass. It wasn't a reflection, it was something inside the mirror. I enhanced the frame, and the shape became clearer, a dark, jagged silhouette, its eyes faintly glowing. It was watching him, I whispered. Marcus shook his head, disbelief etched across his face. "That doesn't make sense. This isn't some horror movie. Laura, what are we dealing with here?" "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Before we could analyze further, Marcus's phone buzzed. He answered, his face tightening as he listened. When he hung up, he turned to me, his expression grim. "There's been another death. Same ammo-locked room, no visible injuries." "Where?" He hesitated. "Room 309. Same hotel. We arrived back at the Grand Line Hotel to find chaos. Officers were everywhere, and the manager looked like he was on the verge of a breakdown." "2 deaths in the same room," he muttered, pacing back and forth. "We're going to lose all our guests." "Not your biggest problem right now," Marcus said, brushing past him. Inside room 309, the scene was disturbingly similar. The new victim, a woman in her 30s, was slumped in the same chair by the window, her face frozen in fear. I scanned the room, my nerves on edge. The mirror had been replaced, but something about it felt wrong. Marcus leaned in close. "You feel that? The air's heavier," I said. "Like we're being watched." Then I noticed it, the faint buzzing sound, barely audible, coming from the mirror. "Marcus," I said, stepping closer, "something's happening." Before he could respond, the buzzing grew louder. The mirror began to vibrate, and I saw the dark shape moving inside the glass, its jagged edges shifting and twisting. And then, in a voice that wasn't quite human, it spoke, "Leave." The lights flickered violently, and a shadow erupted from the mirror, filling the room with darkness. I felt a cold, suffocating force wrap around me, and for a moment I thought it was the end. But then Marcus grabbed my arm and yanked me out of the room. We stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air as the door to room 309 slammed shut behind us. "Laura," he said, his voice shaking. "We're not coming back here." I nodded, my heart still racing. As we walked away, I couldn't help but glance back at the door, and there it was, a faint shadow in the peephole, watching us leave. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. This will help me work better and faster for you. I would be grateful, so watch my other videos.